Howdy, folks. Welcome back to the podcast. Katie and I are home after a phenomenal trip to see my family for Christmas. And we're excited to talk about Christian, millennials or just young Christians dishonoring their parents. You wouldn't have thought that we'd be excited to talk about that, but we are thrilled. In fact, you'll see how thrilled we are here in a little bit. But before we jump into today's episode, we did want to let you know that we are approaching some deadlines for a couple things. One is the growth initiative. I know I've been saying this for a few weeks now, but I want to make sure everyone that wants to be a part, that anyone, any of you men that want to be a part of this, that's the winter session of the 2025 growth initiative, you need to be enrolled by Thursday, January 2nd. Okay, so depending on when this episode comes out, actually, I know when this episode's coming out, and you're only going to have a couple days left to enroll. But enrollment closes on the evening of Thursday, that night. And so then we will have 1 week of preparation where you will be getting your materials, instructions, and then the live 6-week coaching program kicks off on January 9th, the following Thursday, and it runs for 6 weeks. I'm thrilled already with some of you, with all of you that have joined. I'm thrilled to see some of you and to have spoken with some of you. It's, as always, turning out to be just an incredible group of men that I'm looking forward to growing with and to learning with and to getting to know. And if you want to jump in, you got a couple days left to enroll. You can check the webinar below if you want to learn more. Katie, what were you going to say?
Oh, I'm just going to say, too, we don't know when it's opening up again. This might be the only time in 2025 the Growth Initiative is opening up. And as a result, this will be the only time that the couples package is being available as well. So if you've looked into getting the Get It All Done Club, this is the only way to get it at a very steep discount, and that is purchasing the couples package with your husband and choosing to get lifetime access to the Get It All Done Club while he's going through the 6-week Growth Initiative program. So anyways, I just want to throw that in there because once it's closed in the next couple of days, it's just closed. And definitely, we really don't know when it's going to open and back up again.
Yeah. So if you're interested, if you're a young father, if you're a husband, if you are a Christian man that's looking to grow in your faith and your ability to earn and provide for your family, to advance in your career, to develop more skill sets outside of what you already have or build on what you already have, if you want to grow in your health and to have a generational vision, a vision that goes beyond just surviving the next couple of years, but a vision that actually builds on something, you can check, again, if you think that's you, if you're interested, if you have more questions, check the links below and you'll have some more questions answered. The one last thing I want to tell you that we have a deadline approaching for is our magazine. Once again, this is time sensitive. We're closing down the order capabilities for that at the end of this week as well. And so we'll link that below. If you're interested in ordering our magazine, you sign up. We're only doing full year subscriptions. And so you get 4 editions, you get 4 copies when you sign up now. And this is, we're not really planning on opening it up again. Okay. This is the type of thing that we're offering. It's going to be kind of like a limited edition. Honestly, it's probably going to be pretty exclusive when it's all said and done.
In terms of the annual thing.
Yes.
In terms of the annual subscription, you might be able to buy one-off magazines in the future. We don't know.
Like on the resale market, like when people are.
No, it's the Wild West. We've never done a physical print magazine out there before. We're really excited about the contributors that we have contributing to this magazine, but we can't make any promises going forward aside from the annual subscription that is closing down in a couple weeks. So we'll see what happens from there.
Yeah. So again, if you want the magazine, you got to sign up now. And that concludes today's commercials. So we'll get this thing rolling.
The Now That We're a Family podcast.
Well, as I already said, we were with my family over the Christmas week, which was thorough. We enjoyed that so much. What a rich time with them. And we were talking with 2 of my younger brothers, and one of them said in passing, I think we said something regarding parents, or that got breached. The subject of our parents got breached, and one of them said in passing, like, it was along the lines. I'm totally paraphrasing, but it was like, well, I'm not a millennial, so I don't complain about my parents, like you guys do, something along those lines, and it really raised the point and raised the question. It's kind of like, wow, that is actually insane that has become such an accepted expectation for our generation. And It is weird that we not only accept the criticizing of parents when you hear it from secular people, but I really think it's crept in to the church, like so many negative things that happen in culture do. And I realized when I started thinking about it, it was that one, and we didn't even talk about it that long. It's like my brothers mentioned that. And like I said, they're younger than us. They're not in that, whatever that millennial age range is, roughly like 30 to 45 or something. They're in their early 20s. And so that's the context in which they were just making this passing comment. But then I laid in bed that night thinking about how comfortable I've gotten kind of deconstructing my childhood and laying a lot of blame on my parents for any shortcomings I might have. And it's never direct. I never say it directly like that because you know how silly that sounds, but I in some fashion take the blame off of myself for having a shortcoming. And, maybe not in these many words, but say, if it wasn't for my parents doing this, or had my parents done it this way, things could be so different. And really, since that conversation, I have been more and more convicted as I replay the last, few years of my life since getting married, since having children, and how I've not obeyed Scripture when it talks about honoring your father and mother. And as happens, once you become convicted of something, not only, are you trying to learn and grow, I think you become hyper aware of those same things happening around you. And I can't believe in some ways how typical it is, how normal it is for millennial Christians or Christians that are in their 30s-ish, that are young parents, that are, happily married, to be able to make passing comments regarding their parents and in a negative way, paint their parents in something less than positive, right? In something that kind of leaves room for you to be like, oh, okay, well, I know, I get it. Like, I know how your parents are. And that's accepted because it's a direct disobedience to God and his word. And yet we wouldn't tolerate this in other areas. But because there is this phenomenon of, this, I guess, kind of, what do you call it? Like this animosity, maybe some level of animus between the baby boomer generation and millennials, we now accept disrespect and dishonoring even as Christians. And I'm just highly convicted, and I'm really actually excited because as we're going to talk about today, I think that this is actually going to be one of the most liberating things in my growth as a Christian and in my ability to lead my family, for a variety of reasons. But that's kind of what sparked the conversation amongst us. I know we've talked about it before, Katie, but I'm curious as to what your thoughts have been kind of leading up to talking about it.
Well, what's interesting is for me, when you brought this up, because I wasn't really in the conversation, but you brought this up and I was like, oh yeah, and like Gen Z does this too. And you were like, no, like that's the point. Like it is unique to the millennial generation. And I'm really curious why that is. I'm wondering if it's because we have children. And so then in parenting, you can take it as it puts a different perspective on it, on your childhood or whatever, because you are breaking down, okay, why did my parents do it this way? Why didn't they do it this way? You're looking at the different options. Like, I'm wondering if it's like the way our generation, I guess, was raised, or if the next generation to come along will be just as entitled or just as critical about their parents when they hit raising children. Mm-hmm. Because you're right. Like, is this a passing phase, I guess, with like the boom of therapy, the boom of looking back and dissecting everything about your past, which can be a positive thing, can be totally negative and unhelpful. Or is it something that's going to continue to perpetuate down through generations? Because I do feel like victimhood is something that is continuing. And this is just, to me, it seems like a form of victimhood for us to want to point the blame at someone else for why we aren't in a certain place in life, or, why we could have been such better kids if we'd been parented differently, or, Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm kind of curious why.
It will be interesting to see if this is a trend that continues on. because every generation has had disobedient children, has had disrespectful children, has had rebellious children, obviously when they're young, but then continuing on. And the Bible addresses it in different stories where there are adult children that dishonor their parents and it doesn't go well for them. So it's not like, oh, this is a brand new sin. Obviously, the fact that it was established as a 10 commandment to honor your father and mother meant that it was not just that it was important to God, but also it probably wasn't going to come naturally either, that there was going to be this tension. And so I don't want to make it sound like I didn't think this ever happened, but there is something exceptional, it seems like, going on. It's a phenomenon on some level where statistically it seems to have increased in the negative tension between the generations. Go ahead.
Well, okay, I do think it has increased because you were just reading Teddy Roosevelt's the River of Doubt.
Yeah, River. Yeah, yep.
And you were saying, it's so interesting how I read this book, and he seemed to have a good relationship with his sons, and that all of his sons speak well of him.
Yes, because it's got a lot of their correspondence. It's got his sons' letters to him in the book. Yeah.
And so his sons are speaking well of him and thinking their dad's a legend, and yet their dad's like absent for huge periods of time. When you like go down the way Teddy Roosevelt parented, I guess, it wasn't necessarily super admirable. He was a showy guy. He did some incredible things with his kids that were big memory makers and stuff like that. But when you look at parenting over a long period of time, it's not really just the big memory maker moments that typically result in a healthy relationship with a child. It's consistency over time. It's being there over time. And so it's just it was fascinating at first we were like, wow. So like basically all the threads of parenting that seem to be applicable today, like weren't applicable in Teddy's situation, and that his sons just thought he was the man and aren't pointing the finger at their dad. But then we were kind of considering it, and we're like, oh, you know what? Like back in the day, you were considered a weak person to put the blame on your parents.
Or it was just whether you're considered a weak person, it put you in a poor light.
Admirable is what I'm trying to say.
It made you look bad.
Yeah, you looked bad when you tried to make your parents look bad.
Right.
You looked better when you just sucked up whatever, hurt or whatever you went through, and you chose to acknowledge what was admirable about your parent. And so I do think that it's a new thing where now it's admirable to just share your weeping wounds. And the more you have, the better. And the loftier your position because you survived so much trauma, instead of just speaking honorably about our parents, regardless of their shortcomings.
Yeah. And I'm sure that a lot of this is probably downstream or just kind of some peripheral damage from critical theory or from, like you said, the the hyper focus on therapy, and just kind of like even that therapeutic deism that certain pastors have talked about, even the way Christianity is viewed now by many people. And so I do think that it's not just directed towards our parents, it's directed towards our past in general. And this is, I think, a trait that is consistent with successful people, is that they speak of their past and they choose to frame it in a positive light. Because, it's obvious that each generation is going to have unique challenges, but with that, unique opportunities. And so who are going to be the people that are leaders and that are successful and that are the people we read about and hear from? And when when they are passed on as the people that chose to focus and highlight the opportunities and make the most of the opportunities and not focus and highlight the unique challenges of their generation. So I think that's going to be a consistent theme for the history of the world, because like you said, people that are just generally victims will find it in how their parents parented them. They'll find it in the town that they were brought up in. They'll find it in their in their coach that they had or didn't have, in one of their teachers, and then you can go on down the line in the government that they were brought up in the environment that they were brought up in. You can go on and find the reasons why you aren't something that maybe you thought you could have been or that other people think you could be. But then I'm going to say one more thing. You talked about, will we continue on to see like, it's just our age range now because people our age are having kids. They're a few years into marriage, and now they're the ones that, wanted to be buying homes, and now they're then they're not able to buy homes like the baby boomers were, or now they're parenting their children. And so it's making them really evaluate how they were parented because they're having these real-time interactions with their children. But I read a study by a University of New York, or is it NYU? What's that college? Is it NYU? Yeah, a Stern professor.
Sounds
I pulled it
good.
up here. Yeah. And then he had so the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania, a couple co-authors to this, but they were breaking down the millennial versus baby boomer tension. And this is pretty recent. I think it was in 2020. Let me see here the year. This is 2023. Okay. So
Yeah,
it was just
super
over a year ago in August. And they did a deep dive in this academic study. And it was interesting because they said one thing here. I'm going to read it. It says generational identities differ markedly from more commonly studied age-based identities, i.e. younger and older adults. Age categories have no clear boundaries, i.e. they may be idiosyncratically defined by each individual and they are transitory. Today's old were once young. Today's young will one day be old. In contrast, generational categories are rigid. In other ways, so when we use the term millennial, it's like that we will always be millennials and baby boomers will always be baby boomers. And in doing this, they're saying that it complicates the way people view things, because it used to be like, oh, they are older, so that's why they do that. I'm younger, that's why I do that. And actually, when you look at this compared to how the Bible speaks of it, the Bible speaks of youth. It speaks of elderly. It says, the younger are to honor the older. It doesn't talk generationally. It doesn't say, well, if you were born, in whatever, the year of our Lord 27, then you're going to have these unique challenges because of the economical climate you were brought up in. It just says directly, younger, honor the older. Children, honor your parents. And like so many things, again, it might be downstream from so much critical theory. We cling to any type of identities that we can that are outside of Christ or outside of fatherhood or, motherhood. And even the fact that, and my parents have talked about this, they never refer to themselves based off of their generational identity. Like that's such a new thing. And I think it almost probably always used to be talked about in a sociological sense, maybe academically or by marketers. It's like, how are we going to market this demographic? But even once again, they would usually be marketing for a particular age range. There's like, okay, what are 19-year-olds into these days? Or what are 32-year-olds into these days? And I'm saying that to contrast a little bit, or what you're saying, like there is something unique that's showing up in the tension in this study, in the tension between baby boomers and millennials. And again, there's going to be an array of reasons why that they are going to, their conclusions are going to point a few different directions. You can point to the economic climate that the baby boomers brought up. And the point is, as I already said, regardless of what the reasons are that we have a beef with the next generation, it's unbiblical, it's unchristian. And so while the rest of the world is going down this path of being victims and blaming it on their parents, and saying they can't buy a house now and their parents are blaming them, and their parents didn't set them up good enough, their parents should have planned ahead. I tell you what, I read in other posts, this is hilarious, and I'm going to get back to my point. It was by the Huffington Post, and I'm going to pull this up because it was the titles like Grace is, 13 things millennials wish their parents had done differently. And I was like, this will be interesting. So the Huffington Post, or the Huff Post, this liberal outlet. So it's not like somebody that I would go to for an authority, but it is interesting to see what these people are writing about. And within their own writing, the number of times they contradict themselves. So like point one, wish they would have been more firm and practical in their career advice. And they go through, and so that's number one. And this person goes through and says, man, I wanted to do this and I tried this out and I ended up working in cabinets, but then, my parents said, okay, you can try that if you want to try that. I tried it and then I tried this. And by the time I was 32, I didn't have any like tangible credentials. I wish my parents would have been a lot more rigid and being like, hey, go get a degree. And he's saying, then I had to go back and get an architect degree after the fact. Okay. Cause that was something that, and I wish my parents, literally number 4. Okay. Right here. So that was number 1. Number 4, I wish my parents didn't insist on going straight to a 4-year college after graduation. Like this is in their own article. Like it's like you got the one kid that's like, yeah, my parents were the worst. They didn't encourage me to go to college right away. They just kind of let me try things out. The next person they're interviewing, four people later, man, I wish my parents hadn't like encouraged me or forced me, they say, into going straight to college. It's like, yeah, you're right. It's like, wait, weren't we just saying
the parents
that,
can't win?
Yeah.
Right?
So that's one example. And one person's, again, this is all in the same article saying, I wish my parents would have been more intentional and showed me how to be healthy, how to manage my weight. I'm struggling with all this weight now. And I feel it's because of my parents. And we could probably all relate to things like that. You're kind of like, oh yeah, like, my parents weren't as health conscious as they are now. That was one. You go down to like 4 people later. I wish my parents would have been just more accepting of my body and wouldn't have cared so much about me losing weight when I was a kid. And you're kind of like, man, these parents can't win, right? It's actually sad, but how in the same article, you've got one millennial being like, my parents, I'm really disappointed in their lack of, encouraged me to go to college. A couple people later, yeah, my parents were the worst. They encouraged me to go to college. And you step back and you're like, oh, this is kind of funny that we all get to choose how we look back and frame our past. Again, these are not Christian people. This is a liberal outlet. And so we should expect them to have inconsistencies in how they view how parents should parent. But the problem is that this bleeds over into Christianity. And we see it day in and day out, and it's bled into the way I view my parents. And it has been one of the most convicting weeks for me as I think through the number of things I've pinned on my parents and just said, well, man, if it weren't, had they done this, I'm sure I would be in a better position now. And I tell you what, I do not want to do that ever again. I want to walk free from that. And it actually gets me excited because, as I said, there's some things that I'm really excited about for that.
Well, I think it's funny when I hear this article because it's not necessarily like the Huffington Post saying what parents got wrong, right? It's just a survey of millennials sharing their experiences. And so it just goes to show that for every experience that where we're struggling now, it's easy to place the blame on the past. And I think of that with just going to kind of the victimhood that we have as like our generation, how it's just been accepted and applauded. I was reading a book at my mother-in-law's house. She has the best books. And actually, I feel like when I go to either one of our parents' house, I always am writing down book recommendations. But it was called the End of Parenting or the Collapse of Parenting.
Yeah, I should look
The Collapse
that up.
of Parenting. I really want to get the author on the podcast.
Yeah,
by the way,
it sounds like this is great. You loved it. I'm excited to read this book.
He's incredible. But anyways, and he was talking about how it used to be that girls on social media wanted to present perfection, right? That was the desire, was to be perfect. And now that is just basic or normal. It's uninteresting. No one wants perfect anymore. What is better, what trumps perfect, is the more that you've overcome. So like being a part of the LGBTQ plus community, having disorders, having manias, having anxiety and depression. Those are now things that get you more popularity and more approval from people. And so now it's like the more that we can say, I was abused, I was traumatized, I am a broken person, and the more ways we can point to that, then the more popularity that evokes and the more praise that evokes. And so just the way that our culture is driving this praise cycle, it's not for people who've actually overcome and that they choose not to speak about it, because you think of it in history in the past, you read stories about great leaders, great generals, all these things. And you're like, whoa, they overcame so much. And you never hear about it. Like it's never from their perspective that they're telling the story. Someone else is choosing to go and be like, hey, this was a great man. This was a great woman. And then point out the things that they overcame for them. But even outside of those overcomings, they were just considered a great person. And now in order to be considered great, we kind of have to squash everyone else down around us, make them look like losers because we want the bar to be so low for us when it comes to achievement. Like, hey, I'm still here. I'm alive. Like I'm a winner, instead of actually going out and doing something with our lives that's praiseworthy. anyways, I just think it's kind of interesting.
Yeah, that is interesting that he talks about that. And when I think of wanting to stand apart from the world, because we know we're a peculiar people set apart to proclaim the glory of him that's called us out of darkness and into his marvelous light. It's fun when you are able to see how obedience in particular areas kind of just naturally makes you peculiar, right? How, staying married, and you get to not only enjoy the blessing of marriage, you actually are being a peculiar Christian, a peculiar person that brings glory and honor to God, that points people to God by literally staying married. Okay. And you're like, well, is it a fruitful marriage? Is it a healthy marriage? It's like, well, that's ideal, but just staying married is a good thing. Raising up godly children, pouring into your children, that's peculiar. The fruit of it is something that stands out in this world. And again, throughout this week of conviction, I'm realizing how obeying that commandment to honor your father and mother, not just that one commandment. I'm going to read some verses that the Bible speaks to this, because that's the famous Deuteronomy 5:16, honor your father and your mother as the Lord your God commanded you, that your that may be long and that it may go well with you in the land that the Lord your God is giving you. And I actually am convinced on there being some practical, like very tangible blessings that come along and advantages that come along with honoring your parents and choosing to speak well of them that I'm going to talk about. Exodus 20:12, honor your father and your mother, that your days may be long in the land that the Lord your God is giving you. And then, of course, we've got Proverbs 20-22. Listen to your father who gave you life, and do not despise your mother when she is old. So it's not this isn't just talking about young children, right? This isn't children obey your parents that we think about in Ephesians. This is when your mother's old, do not despise her. And I think that it's the same with fathers as well.
But it always stuck out to me that I do think it matters when the Bible highlights a certain gender, and people like to think it doesn't matter, but I think it does. And obviously it could apply to both, but when he chooses to specify, why choose to specify? Because you think of it, and I do think old ladies tend to get more annoying than older men. And so I think it would be easier, like stereotypically, to despise your mother when she's old, because she just gets more, not my mom. She's awesome, but she also acts a lot younger than she is, or your mom. But you know what I'm saying? Like older women tend to get a little more grouchy and nitpicky and annoying to be around than older men.
Okay. If you say so, I'm not going to say yay or nay on that one.
It's a fear I have.
I know
it's a fear I have when it comes to getting old. I take that as a warning verse.
Yeah. Exodus 21:17, whoever curses his father or his mother shall be put to death. That's the commandment there. Leviticus 19:3, every one of you shall revere his mother and his father, and you shall keep my Sabbaths. I am the Lord your God. We talk about keeping the Sabbath. We talk about, again, the other commandments, like, not lusting after somebody else's wife, not stealing, not, having false idols, not committing idolatry or adultery. And yet the honoring your father and mother, it's like we say, children should obey their parents when they're young, but at least I can speak for myself. I haven't given a lot of reverence to that passage, and in so doing, a lot of reverence to my parents, as these verses talk about. And I would hope that I speak, publicly well of my parents, and I want to continue doing that, because I genuinely love. They are, to me, and that's what's insane, is like, anybody that knew my parents would be like, wow, like, what are you finding to complain about your childhood? It's incredible. And it's like, that's what the human heart does. It's capable of finding the worst things possible and dwelling on those things and putting the blame on someone else. And so that's why it is probably more convicting for me than maybe anyone else, because I do feel like I actually have better parents than any other parents that I've seen out in the world. But again, there's verse after verse after verse, and many of our listeners know these verses. So I'm not going to keep reading them, but just think about how fun it is, how life-giving it is to see a husband and a wife late in their marriage enjoying one another. You're like, that's a testimony of God's faithfulness, of the picture of marriage. It's honoring. When people have integrity in business, you're like, that's a testimony to God's goodness. When people bring up their children in the nurture and admonition of the Lord, it's a testimony to God and people that honor him. And I think that I've just missed how honoring your parents is the exact same thing. When adult children speak well of their parents, it stands out. It really sticks out. And not only does it make you admire, it makes you admire the parents, which is honoring your parents. like which is what these are talking about, it actually makes you honor and respect that person more. You're thinking, what an awesome person for choosing to speak well of their parents. And so on the positive side, I think that this is a golden opportunity for millennial Christians to stand out from the world in such a positive, life-giving, and an attractive and appealing way. To be like, who are those people? Like, the rest of the world is complaining about the rest of millennials are complaining about the baby boomer generation. These Christians speak so well of them. They lift them up. They find the best things to say about them. Like, that's so unique. That's so different. And I do think it is an opportunity and so to honor our parents and to stand out. But I think it's an amazing opportunity for growth, because I'm going to get into another point here that, your dad really, I guess, illuminated as being something that is very profound and has already changed my life, and I think will continue to change my life in a very impactful way. But when you are able to free yourself from the negative things that happened in your childhood that you see in your parents, you are freeing yourself, I think, as God made us, to walk in the newness of life that we have in Christ. And for whatever reason, I've given myself license, and I've given other Christians my age license to disobey God in that manner and to be held captive by a negative memory that they have from their parents. And this is different too than a negative or a sinful act. Like somebody being like, oh, so am I supposed to say, like, I think it's great that my dad cheated on my mom, or that my mom left us, or that it's like, no, those are acts that you can hate. You can hate the sin and really, you can even begrudge the sin. Be like, that was a terrible thing. We all know that's a terrible thing, especially if you're a victim of a sexual abuse or of physical abuse as a child. I'm not saying you're supposed to embrace that, but we've all met people that have had those things happen in their life. And what do? They fix their eyes upon Christ and the newness of life they have in Him, and they actually are able to forgive their parents, which is, once again, one of the most powerful testimonies we ever get to hear.
Supernatural, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And it's like, I mean, and hopefully Christians should be living a supernatural life if we've got the Spirit of God that raised Christ from the dead dwelling within us. So anyways, I'm really fired up because I think that this is such a great opportunity for Christians to stand out, to point people to the Lord, and then to reap the benefit. Like it says directly that it may go well with you in the land. And so again, not that we're here doing the whole quid pro quo thing with God, being like, well, He said if I do this, then He's going to, give me this in return. And we don't want to view God as this celestial vending machine, but He has ordained the world to be so that, and because I can even break this down probably in a far more naturalistic way, like self-help people do this all the time. When you choose to focus on the positive, you're just a more successful person. And I feel like God's giving us some ingredients there, even in the commandments, being like, hey, if you honor your father and mother, if you choose when you are an adult to look back and to focus on the good, to praise them for the things that were praiseworthy, it is going to benefit you immensely in your life. You will be a highly effective individual that will be prosperous throughout your time. And I'm like, man, what a secret weapon Christians have in this day.
Yeah. And you mentioned too, this goes beyond, like, parents are one element of this, and letting our past define us, letting our past shape us, and letting our past really like become our identity when it comes to moving forward. And this concept that you're going to transition into, what is that? Do you remember that statement that my dad said? It was a passing comment. We want him to get it on the podcast to flesh it out more, but it was something that his business coach told him that he passed on to us, like a lot of the things that really stick out to us. But it was like, until your past serves you.
So I want, because this is the great thing about your dad and Dan Sullivan, is that every word matters.
Yeah.
So I hate trying to, quote people and be like, I think it's along these lines, but I'm going to do that. And so this isn't going to do it justice because I don't think I have all the words right. But Chad said in passing, he said, yeah, well, Dan Sullivan would always say, and Dan Sullivan's his business coach, he'd always say, I can't help someone choose a better future until they choose a better past. And I think that's pretty close.
I think that's good. Yeah, I think you nailed it.
Well, I knew the word choose was in there. And so
Okay.
he's saying, I can't help you choose a better future until you choose a better past. And I was like, whoa, that is crazy, because I've spent so much of my young adult life deconstructing my teenage years, my early 20s, and just beating myself up or beating up, metaphorically, my parents for decisions that they didn't make or that they, allowed me to make, or whatever you want to say. And when he said that, I was like, that is incredible. And he goes, yeah. And he asked the question, because he's asked this before in workshops when I'm with him. He goes, does your past serve you? I'm like, does my past serve me? What are you talking about? My past it just is. Like, and that's how we all view so many things in our past. We're like, what are you talking about? Those are factual, historical, like done, set in stone things. So I can't choose to have it serve me, or I can't choose a better past, right? Like, we're here to talk about my future. Okay. Give me some things for how I can get out of where I'm at now into a better place.
Yeah.
And
the
he's saying,
past is not moldable.
Exactly.
The future is. But what this quote is essentially saying is,
no, your past is moldable.
Your past is just as moldable as your future, which is kind of crazy.
Right. And I know everybody's going to point to those hard, fast things. Like, no, I know that on this day, this happened. And so you can't say that can be changed. It's set in stone. That's not what we're talking about. I think when you start thinking about it, you know exactly what the quote means. You're thinking how you are viewing your past here today. Is the way you're viewing your past serving you or not? And until you choose a past that serves you, until you choose to have, to view your past in a way that's advantageous, you're not going to be able to, gain a better future.
Well, I think of someone like Johnny Erickson Tata, it's like, okay, she objectively jumped in a lake and broke her neck and became a paraplegic. And how she chose to view her past initially, she was totally justified in, which is like, my life's lame and over, and I could have been a normal person had this one event not happened to me. Mm-hmm. But then as the Lord worked in her life, she chose to view her past as something that God allowed for a purpose. So what does he have for her? And it became a very positive thing and became a very big ministry. That's just like one example of someone where I feel like they had a very traumatic past. You can't change the event that happened, but why did God allow that event? He clearly did. It was for his purposes. And you wouldn't be here today if it wasn't for your past either.
Well, that's what's insane. There's that poem that I don't know, but it's that Robert Frost, The Path Less Traveled. Yeah, exactly. And that's been speaking to me this week as well. And I probably should have it memorized at this point, but I don't, because we look back to the cross, because the nice thing about Christianity is that it is a historical faith. There's a historical track record here, not just to the church, but actually the historical evidence of the resurrection of Jesus Christ. We can point to a time and place in history when God entered the world as man and took on our sins and then rose from the dead. And so we look back to the cross and to the empty tomb, and we're thinking, that's right. That's the substance of my faith, or that's something that I can hang my hat on right there. But then we don't look back at our past and obey Christ and say that, but my past is redeemed. Like, old things have passed away. Behold, all things have become new. And so what about my past that I'm hanging on to is not helping the new creation in Christ? Like, why am I dragging that along with me throughout this life? And I think that's why I'm excited, is I feel lighter than ever. Because we can talk about forgiving ourselves, or, I shouldn't say forgiving ourselves, because it's like, what, we offended ourselves, we offended God, or we offended other people. But we can accept or believe in God's forgiveness and truly walk free from past sins, or we can dwell in them and stoop in them, be like, shoulda, coulda, woulda, why did I do that? And rather than embracing the beauty of the finished work and the new creation that we are. Okay. So that's something that we can talk about as Christians. And I think we do. And I think we should, and saying, hey, you need to move on and walk freed from you're living in condemnation. There is no condemnation for those that are in Christ Jesus. And so you need to be freed from that thing that you failed in and walk in the newness of life in Christ. And yet we don't identify these other things as being sin when we're saying like, well, no, this wasn't a sin. I can't believe. It could be as basic as like, I didn't invest in whatever, like I didn't invest in big. I wish my parents would have told me about, the scholarship program, and you're just going to your past and just being like, yeah, just they all they could have done was just, sent me a link to the thing when I was 18. I could have signed up. I knew I could have gotten the scholarship. Or why didn't they tell me about trade schools? Or, my parents never sat down and read the Bible with me, or they never taught me about systematic theology. Because it's like, my parents read the Bible with me every day. They didn't teach me about systematic theology. So it's like, what am I going to choose to focus on right there? I mean, how many of our listeners are like, what? Your parents read the Bible to you every day? And I'm like, yeah, that's how wealthy I am. And yet, because of the sinfulness of my heart and the deceitfulness, I could choose to focus on something they didn't bring to my attention as a child. And that is not fully embracing the newness of life that we have in Christ. And it is lording other people's sins over them. We've talked about how wrong this is to do to your spouse, right? Like people will hold something that, their spouse did, maybe even before they were married, against them. And what a wicked thing to do, to say, well, I know it, I knew who you were before we got married. I knew who you were before you were saved. You've got all sorts of things in your checkered past, and spouses will do that to each other, just to their own total death. Like, talk about the death of a marriage and the death of joy. But then in lesser ways, we do that with our parents. We'll say, yeah, our parents are what, in their 50s, 60s, 70s. It's like they put in the work. They know, like, you don't need to let them know that they made mistakes. Like, we all know everyone's going to make mistakes in parenting, and yet we'll just keep it there. We're just going to keep bringing it up in these areas that they fell short in their parenting. And then even sometimes take away that crown of glory. Is it the Proverbs that says an old man's, or children's children are an old man's,
the crown to old men.
The crown to old men. And we'll withhold that from our parents. Well, I'm not going to let my grandkids be around them. And I'm not talking about putting your children in harm's way, right? I'm not talking about your kids not being safe, but actually honoring God and saying, yeah, no, I don't trust my mom and dad with my children alone, but we are going to meet up at the park. I'm going to honor my parents. I mean, that makes me emotional, actually, to think about withholding the crown of glory from my parents. I mean, like, no, you don't get time with my kids, right? Because of what? Well, because of this thing you did in my past. And it's like, what a testimony to say, look at the goodness of God. This is your crown of glory. And you get to, maybe it's in extremely small doses, but you get to witness and enjoy and take pleasure in your grandchildren, your children's children, which are your crown of glory. I hate this so much. It's so embarrassing. I really got to edit this.
I think it's so
I need to edit this out of my life is what I do.
No,
need to do. It is. I don't.
Because you care so much.
But it's just, there's no excuse for crying in the middle of talking. It's just really embarrassing, honestly.
That's not true. What era are you living in? Strong men can cry.
You said error? What era am I living in?
Well, I think too, when you look back on, this is two reasons too why this is just a game where parents can never win and kids can never lose. If the more victimized you are, then the better you are, because you have all the information. So yeah, you know how it is to be a parent. Like, we're walking down a dark tunnel in faith, seeking God's word, praying, dealing with the information that we know, and we don't necessarily know how every decision we're going to make for our child's life is going to impact them 20 or 30 years down the road. Or, oh man, we overlooked so-and-so at a moment that was just integral in their development and we thought they were okay. Like, or we let them go over to that friend's house. We really thought it was okay. Like, you make so many decisions every given day with the information you have. And no duh, if you look back 20 or 30 years later and know the ramifications of every decision you'd made, we'd all make different ones at every stage in our life. And so we could do this with our parents, and we can also do this with our own decisions we made with our past, or that the Lord, honestly, like, in his sovereignty, really trusting God's sovereignty for our past, I think is super important, because not just his sovereignty with our future, but being like, hey, he allowed me to either rule out that information, not think it was helpful for me to make that decision, or, to go to college or not go to college, or to join the military or not join the military, or, all these different things, be friends with that person or not be friends with that person. Or he very clearly directed our steps to do something totally different, and
Yes.
or blinded our eyes to that information that was out there. And you're like, well, if I would have known, I would have done this. And you're like, well, guess what? You didn't know, and you could have known because so-and-so did know. And so I think we have to really just realize, like, this is a game. It's easy to play if you want to score our past.
Yeah.
Exactly. There's plenty of ammunition there. It's just unhelpful for our future and our present and the relationships around us that matter.
You said something that got brought up in that NYU paper. You talked about, if you actually think about what our parents knew 30 years ago or however many years ago, they were working with the information that they had. We have different information. We've got, way more resources. We just know we're in a different spot. He was talking about when you lean into those generational identities versus the age identities, then you're not even able to do that. Because that's going back to what the Bible talks about. It's like, oh, our parents were young parents. Instead of saying our parents were baby boomers, like our parents were in this generation. It's like, no, my dad was a 30-year-old father that was young, that was inexperienced, that was was being a father for the first time. And say, well, even if they had multiple kids, they were being the father to 4 kids for the first time, and then they were being the father to 5 kids for first time. Whereas that generational thinking, when we just identify in just that time in history and we don't actually think of the age identifier, we have far less grace for people. And we just think, well, of course they should have known everything because they were, they did this on purpose because they know it now. And they didn't know, they should have known it then too. And of course we know that's not how life works. We're dealing with a completely different, we're dealing with completely different information than what our parents had, and opportunities and challenges. And so it's like, we also assume that our parents didn't have challenges. It's like, well, of course they had challenges. Anyways, yeah.
Yeah. Well, it's like on that day that, I snapped at my kids, I'm pointing to 7 different stressors and blah, blah, blah. Or the day I overlooked what was a better decision for that situation. Or, Elisha and I were at a place in our marriage where we were disagreeing on parenting decisions or whatever. And you know what I'm saying? Like there's marital stress, there's relational stress, there's all these different random stressors. But when we picture our parents' life, they're in a vacuum. Mm-hmm. They had perfect clarity and chose to do this to us.
Yes. Yeah. So anyways, I do think that, just to kind of wrap this thing up, I think an area that I'm highly convicted and just really want to see this practically played out in my life is choosing to speak well of my parents, both privately and publicly, to think about them, to honor them in my heart and in my thoughts. Because it's one thing to publicly present your parents in a certain way, but how are you dwelling on them? How am I thinking about my parents? And then I think the thing that I've heard this the most and I've contributed to these things too, is maybe you're a first generation Christian. And so you're saying, well, had my parents done this, that, or the other? Amazing opportunity for being a testimony of God's goodness in your life and a testimony to your parents when you speak well of them and choose to honor them. And then also, I think of how much, like, my parents were radicals for homeschooling, and I'm crazy grateful that I was homeschooled. But to hear people say, like, man, I just wish my parents would have homeschooled me, or I wish it's like that, like, they didn't know a thing. Like, nobody did that. Like, weirdos did that. And I think that the more, and this is probably going to happen your whole life, the more, I guess, like, totally paradigm shifting moments you have in your life, it's always going to give you an opportunity to begrudge something your parents didn't do. It's like, oh, I found out this savings hack. Oh man. Like, I found out that this thing about the public schools. Oh man. Like, why didn't my parents, I found out this thing theologically, like, why didn't I know about this school of thought theologically?
I-
Why didn't I know about this, spiritual discipline? And as you're growing, you truly are learning new things and adding tools to your tool belt. And then you have this opportunity to look back and be like, why didn't my parent give me that tool? And it's such a negative way to view the blessing that is you coming into possession of this new tool, or the Lord showing you a new thing.
I felt this way when I had no credit in marriage.
Yes.
Because my parents gave us like incredible money management skills. And one of them was just like, hey, just don't bother with credit. Even though both my parents used credit, they just didn't see it as being a necessary part of our life. And then Elisha and I were trying to buy, what were we trying to buy? We were trying to look into buying a house, and we realized, we need some kind of credit, not just a bunch of savings. So then we couldn't even get windshield wipers on credit, which was the funny thing. And I remember calling my dad and be like, I cannot get windshield wipers on credit. Like, why didn't you tell me about this? And instead of being like, wow, I'm not in debt like tons of Americans, we have plenty of savings. We can get a secure credit card and start the process now. And, realizing like, we're so blessed financially because of our parents and I was because of my parents. But just being critical with like, hey, you didn't give me the credit talk,
Yes.
Instead of like, you know what? Guess what? We figured it out. Eventually bought a house. It's all been great.
Yeah. Well, as we've already said, each generation is going to have its unique challenges that are unique to them and opportunities that are unique to them. And how quick we are to blame all the challenges on our parents and to just take the opportunities for granted. Be like, well, of course, duh. And like that belongs to me. Being like, no, praise them for the opportunities and then honor them, knowing that they are failed human beings, even when it comes to the challenges.
Well, speaking of which, we have a baby who I thought was asleep and is not.
Yeah.
Just thinking I need to go in and calm him down.
Yeah. So let's go do that. Folks, thank you all so much for listening, and we'll talk to you next time. Bye-bye.
Bye.